Morning all, and welcome to this first bite size on formative teaching, where we'll be looking at sharing success criteria. Part of this will be looking at the creation of success criteria and how we can use that criteria to engage our students and then hopefully get them to a point where they are being as independent as possible within their learning. In terms of all of the processes that we'll be looking at throughout this series then, as I said, today we'll be looking at sharing success criteria, but the future bite size will then be looking at feedback to move forwards, peer feedback, self-feedback, and then finally any kind of discussions that we can use to elicit learning. So when we start to think about putting our success criteria together, we need to think about a few key things. They're going to make sure that our success criteria are accessible to our students, but also engaging so that they can become as independent as possible. So the first thing to consider will be the concepts that we are looking to include within any lesson or any learning episode. So what are those key concepts that we're approaching that therefore then link back to the overarching topic, that link back to our scheme of work? From here, we can then decide on the content itself. So what is that core knowledge that will be developed in any lesson, any learning episode, any specific activity that we're expecting the students to engage in? And then finally, we need to consider the specific skills that students are going to be developing throughout any learning episode. How will that knowledge be used? How will they be expected to show that they know more and can do more by the end of any learning episode? Really, as a set of guidelines then, we need our success criteria to be clear, they need to be concise, and they need to be desirably difficult. And that word desirably difficult very much relates to the level of challenge that we set within our success criteria that allow them to be accessible for different levels of learner within our classrooms. So when we think about sharing our success criteria, we are looking at now actually producing them. And actually it could be us as teachers, as the experts in the room that produce these success criteria. This is useful initially when we're maybe first starting off schemes of work or new topics or new areas of our curriculum journeys to kind of engage students initially in topic areas. It could also be us that are producing the success criteria for particularly complex topics or where we're looking at maybe including some complex skills. But we should also think about getting our students in a position where they can help co-construct criteria. It might be that we kind of outline the criteria as the teachers and then build them together. And it's been shown that ownership of criteria leads to a much deeper understanding as to not just what students will learn, but also then how they will learn it, but also then how they'll be expected to show what they know and what they can do. Now, this might be easier with higher prior retainers. It might be seen to be easier with students in sixth form. However, actually, what we can start to do is think about the nature of our criteria, think about the nature of what it is we're expecting students to learn, and therefore then engage all levels of learner in this co-construction. Essentially, we're thinking, actually, let's focus upon the learning itself. What is it that I want them to learn? And then we can start to add detail around skills and around how those skills and areas of knowledge will be assessed later on down the line. What we can also do is start to think about our disciplinary literacy at this point and make sure that we're drawing upon that tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary within our success criteria. So we are engaging students within that level of thought and within that level of oracy from as soon as possible within the learning journey itself. To make sure our success criteria is appropriate, it's really important that we make sure that we link our success criteria to our learning intentions within our teaching. So as an example, I'm just going to give you a quick example from some year 12 PE. So learning intention could be to know the structures of the cardiac conduction system so that you understand the control of the cardiac cycle. So I put these two things together because the students need to be aware how the anatomy of the heart leads to the actual physiological mechanical workings of the heartbeat itself, that therefore then determine the different phases of contraction and relaxation within the heart. But keeping it concise and using that tier 3 vocabulary that therefore then engages the students at that level as soon as possible within their learning. Now from this I would then generate some success criteria. Obviously things like gold, silver, bronze are out there, you know, top, middle, bottom, those kinds of things. I tend to use must, should and could. So my must would be you must know the component parts of the cardiac conduction system. Students should be in a position where they know the order of these components and where those components are in the heart. Now that's important because the different parts of the conduction system therefore then have an impact on different parts of the heart. So if they don't know the order of the components, they won't be able to then develop that understanding of the control of the cardiac cycle. And then the final bit, the could, is to describe the flow of innervation to stimulate those different parts of the heart. And again, that stimulation leads to the contraction, which again therefore then allows them that access to that understanding of the control of the cardiac cycle. So my success criteria are really explicitly linked to my learning intention, and by my students going through a process where they achieve each of the elements of the success criteria, they are then able to have that full understanding of the control of the cardiac cycle. Now it might be that we then formatively assess that as we go through in terms of just knowing the structures, then knowing the order of them, then being able to describe that flow. But we'll always then link that learning back to an exam style question, which they'll either just produce as a written answer. I might ask them to kind of write just 5 lines and try and get 5 marks. It might be that I get them to kind of speak their answer through with a partner, but some exposure to how they'll be expected to therefore then respond to that style of question in terms of a more formal assessment. So the final consideration when we are looking at success criteria is how we then use them. Now it might be that we give all of our criteria at the start of the lesson, or it might be that we choose to stage the release of the different success criteria, so that actually as each part of the lesson or the learning is met, we then release the next criteria. So for me, with my cardiac conduction system example, it might be that my first criteria is given as, by the end of this learning activity, you will know the components of the cardiac conduction system. And then when we've done that, we move on to the next one, and we then start to look at the order of those components, and we build the learning around the criteria on a staged process as we go throughout the lesson, so the students are more explicitly aware as to what each part and each learning episode is going to specifically focus on for them. As we go through them, we start to think about building the model for success. So what does success look like for each of the criteria in turn? So if you know this, what does that actually mean? What will you be able to do with that knowledge? How can you prove to me, to yourself and to everybody else that you have learned these different component parts? We also need to take into account about giving out models and giving out exemplars. You know, what does giving an overall waggle, an overall what a good one looks like, actually do to learning? Does it actually stop that kind of level of inquiry? Does it stop that independence because we're already giving away the answers? So can we stagger the release of success if that's possible, but also if it's necessary for different students? Now, it might be that our lower prior retainers do need almost full exemplars to allow them to approach success, but our middle prior retainers, our higher prior retainers, will need less information, less of a fully complete successful example, so that they can be a little bit more independent within their approaches to learning. If we've been really clear as to what our criteria is going to be and what they need to achieve at each part of our lesson, those kind of middle prior retainers, higher prior retainers can be left to be a little bit more independent in terms of working out how they can go about achieving those different elements. thanks so much for listening to this. As with all of the other bite size, if at any point you have any questions about any of the content, then please don't hesitate to get in touch, and the very, very best of luck getting out there and giving these ideas a go.